Tonight on KQED Newsroom, divisions over the Mueller report. Democrats are demanding more information, while Republicans insist it's time to move on. Plus, this week, Gavin Newsom marked his 100th day as governor of California. We'll examine how his vision for the state is shaping up. And a pioneering psychologist reveals how subtle biases can have a big effect on how we view and treat others. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with ongoing fallout from the Mueller report. Investigators laid out numerous incidents where the president believes the FBI, Justice Department, and top aides should follow his orders, even when they may compromise a criminal investigation. House Democrats have now issued a subpoena to compel the Justice Department to release to Congress the full unredacted report and its underlying evidence by May 1st. The move sets up a legal fight with Attorney General William Barr, who yesterday held a press conference before releasing a redacted version of the report. He reiterated his opinion that there was no collusion or obstruction of justice by President Trump. But the report clearly states Mueller's team could not reach a judgment on obstruction and therefore does not, quote, exonerate him. Here now to discuss this is Congresswoman Jackie Speier of San Mateo County. She joins us from Palm Springs, California. Nice to have you back on the program.
Great to be with you.
What do you think are the most concerning findings in the Mueller report?
The Mueller report was really a roadmap for Congress. Because of the Department of Justice guidance about not indicting a sitting president, Mueller's hands were literally tied. So he created a roadmap and was very clear in indicating to Congress, you have got to take this ball and run with it. There are serious, and I want to underscore serious, claims that are being made in that Mueller report around obstruction of justice. And the area that is less focused on is that first volume about the intervention by the Russians and the counterintelligence efforts that were now being pursued by the Mueller camp by having these cases referred out. So there's 14 cases, 2 of which we know of, 12 of which we do not. What is clear in his report, particularly in volume 1, is the Russians used every resource they had. They used every platform, they used social media, they used opportunities to meet with Trump associates. And while you couldn't find a criminality, there was a willingness to work with Russia in terms of coordinating the campaign and the message, both by the Russians and by the Donald Trump campaign.
Does that amount to collusion in your mind? And also the other issue is obstruction of justice. Did you see examples in that report as well that you think amount to obstruction of justice?
Well, first of all, collusion is not a legal term.
Right.
Was there conspiracy to coordinate? I think there was conspiracy to coordinate, but then you have to establish, was there a criminal intent? No, the intent was just to win the election at all costs and using whatever resource they could. So he went as far as he could by indicting the Internet Research Agency out of Russia and a number of the principals there.
So you said that your reading of this report is that it's a roadmap. Is it a roadmap to impeachment proceedings? Do you think there should be impeachment hearings?
I think that the Judiciary Committee needs to have Special Counsel Mueller come in and question him in a very thoughtful manner that will, I think, lead them to more paths to pursue. And if that conversation is, as I think it will be, I think that starting an impeachment process would be in order. You know, our democracy is at stake here. The president has spent 2 years undermining our law enforcement agencies. He has criticized Mueller. He has criticized the FBI. He has placed all kinds of roadblocks in the way of us doing our work. And then he hires Bill Barr, who has become his spokesperson, not the Attorney General, the highest law enforcement officer of the United States on behalf of the American people, but President Trump's mouthpiece.
Congresswoman,
and all of that is
Congressman Eric Swalwell has called for Attorney General Barr to resign. Do you think he should resign?
I actually think that Attorney General Barr should be impeached.
You do?
I do. I actually think
grounds?
He is, because he has so misinformed the American people. He did so intentionally. He made the decision that obstruction of justice did not take place. He basically said that the president was fully innocent, and that is not what the special counsel Mueller said. There's a reason why Mr. Mueller was not at that press conference yesterday. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that he does not see his work product the same way that Attorney General Barr does.
You sit on the House Intelligence Committee. Both your committee and the House Judiciary Committee have called for Special Counsel Robert Mueller to testify before you. What do you hope to hear from Mr. Mueller that you don't already know at this point through this very long report?
So there's 400 pages in the report. There's thousands of pages of background documentation that I think he could help us in sifting through that. I think he does have a perspective. I think he will share that perspective with us. Again, I believe that his hands were tied because of the Department of Justice guidance. And I would also say that that is not law, that is guidance. And it probably is incumbent on Congress now to look at this. Nobody is above the law. Mueller said that himself. Nobody, not the President of the United States. So the fact that there's this guidance by the Department of Justice saying you can't indict a sitting president is, I think, suspect. And I would also say that's why impeachment becomes so important.
Impeachment of the president?
Correct.
Okay, and I have to ask you this because you didn't really directly answer whether you think impeachment hearings should happen. You said give it a little more time, hear from Mr. Mueller first. But if you don't hold an impeachment hearing with this whole report showing a culture of lying, a culture of deception, what message does this send to future presidents? Does it then suggest that they too can engage in all sorts of questionable behavior as long as they feel there's no political will in Congress to impeach them?
So the question is, are these high crimes and misdemeanors? Do the crimes rise to that level? I think that has to be explored by the Judiciary Committee, and that's why I would like them to start that proceedings. But to actually go through the articles and then have it voted on by the House is a much bigger step. I think you have to preliminarily do the review, have the discussions with the special counsel, and then look at the crimes that, and crimes, are different in a congressional setting. So we then need to look at it in those terms.
Some Democrats have suggested that there needs to be new laws so that we can have future presidents play by the rules. What kinds of laws would those look like to prevent some of this kind of conduct from happening in the future?
Well, first and foremost, we have to require every presidential candidate to provide 10 years of previous tax returns. The problem with Donald Trump is he has so many involvements around the world that can, in fact, influence his decision-making on behalf of the American people based on whether he has loans from Saudi Arabia or Russian banks or whether he has business dealings in those countries. We need a president who is thinking first and foremost about the American people and not his personal pocketbook. I actually have introduced legislation that requires 20 years of tax returns for any presidential candidate to participate in the electoral process.
All right. Congresswoman Jackie Speier joining us from Palm Springs, California. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Aside from the extraordinary events unfolding at the national level, this week also highlighted a benchmark in California politics, Governor Gavin Newsom's first 100 days in office. Which promises has he followed through on so far, and what can we expect in the coming months? Here now to analyze the week in politics are Hoover Institution fellow Lanhee Chen, UC Hastings College of the Law professor David Levine, and Tal Kopin, Washington correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle. She joins us via Skype from the nation's capital. Welcome to you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Tal, let's begin with you. What has the scene been like in Washington, D.C. the past couple of days after the Mueller report was released?
Well, one of the things you have to realize about the timing of this release is that it came during the first week of lawmakers' Easter and Passover recess. So the odd thing about it is that the halls of Capitol Hill were largely empty when this report was delivered. In fact, some lawmakers aren't even in the country. This is a popular time to take international trips. And so Nancy Pelosi was actually overseas in Ireland doing sort of a tour through the UK and parts of Europe. And so we had to get a lot of the reaction in our emails, inbox sort of statements. But overall, I think that Washington was really preparing for a report with a lot more redactions. You saw a lot of Democrats pre-buttal sort of focused on Barr and him sort of misconstruing the report in their eyes and preparing for this dogged fight to get the full report and underlying materials. And they haven't really changed the script all that much. You see a few Democrats sort of going after the president, and actually presidential candidate and Senator Elizabeth Warren has said that they should start impeachment proceedings. But by and large, the Democratic leadership is still focusing on Barr and getting the report. They're still saying that even though, these redactions, which were, I think, a lot lighter than people expected, they still want the full thing.
Yeah, and David, from your vantage point as a law professor, is there anything in the report that Robert Mueller could have justifiably concluded amounted to a crime, but perhaps chose not to?
Well, I think that's what he did with the obstruction material, that there's so many instances that look like obstruction or attempted obstruction. And that what Mr. Mueller does is that he says that, well, because of the complications of being able to indict the president, and that if they were to, that you wouldn't have an indictment and so the president couldn't fight back, they decided to shy away from that. And really, the obstruction things, it's really the situation that because McGahn and the other aides refused to do things or ignored directives, that it is that Mr. Trump didn't commit obstruction of justice. The aides saved him.
And Lanhi, basically President Trump is declaring a total victory as a result of the Mueller report. Is it a total victory for him? Because this lays out a really troubling case of culture of lying, a lot of deception. What do you make of it?
Well, a few things are clear. One is that Congress and the Democrats in Congress will not stop. They're going to continue to investigate elements that come out of the Mueller report and things that they've been thinking about for some time with respect to the president's personal financial dealings. Now, more broadly for the president, I do think he can read it as a victory for two reasons. One is nothing in the report took this out of the realm of the political and put it into the realm of the legal. In other words, all of his exposure is political exposure, which I think the president feels much more well equipped to handle. The other element of this is it allows him to continue to come back to themes that he knows are popular with his base. No collusion, no obstruction, and he can talk about things in the report in an adversarial way that really allow him to continue to pitch his base on why they ought to stick with him going into the 2020 electoral cycle. So politically for the president, absolutely, I think it is still a victory that he can claim.
And Tal, you mentioned this earlier about Senator Elizabeth Warren calling for impeachment proceedings. There is a growing call by her and other Democrats for this to happen. Could this issue divide the Democratic Party as we head into the 2020 presidential election?
I think it already is. And, to Lanhi's point, I think, the best news for the president and coming out of this report is I don't think there was anything in it that substantively changed a lot of minds. In fact, a lot of what was in the report we sort of already knew because of the dogged investigative work of the press. And so in a weird way, this sort of drip, drip, drip of news kind of saves him from the impact that this report would have had if we were all reading some of these details fresh for the first time. But you are seeing some Democrats now more comfortable going forward with using the I word here in Washington. You saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a bit of a firebrand now on the progressive left, say she was willing to sign on to her colleague Rashida Tlaib's articles of impeachment. And you saw Elizabeth Warren be the first out of the gate of the presidential candidates, saying she believes impeachment proceedings should be initiated. And of course, Tom Speier, the California philanthropist and billionaire who has started an organization pushing for impeachment, he is already pushing that message. And you see Democratic leadership resisting. And so it already is creating tension, and Democrats are really going to have some soul searching going forward over how they think is the best way to play this, very much aware that we are in the middle of a presidential cycle already.
But I just want to look ahead a little bit, and going back to your legal expertise, David, let's say, can he be indicted on some of the things that were laid out in this report after he leaves office? And what is the statute of limitations on those things?
Sure. The answer is yes, he could. And in fact, I think that part of what Mr. Mueller did is that he explicitly says that what they were doing is that they were preserving evidence. And they do say that certainly one audience would be Congress, but then another audience would be once Mr. Trump leaves office, that it may be that other prosecutors will take it up. On obstruction of justice, it's a 5-year statute of limitations.
But if he gets reelected and he has another 4 years, could he run out the clock on those statute of limitations?
On the events that took place in 2017, yes. If we're talking about him not getting out of office until January 20th at noon on 2025, then yes, you could run the clock on those. But if he does not win re-election, then he would be vulnerable on obstruction of justice charges.
Okay, and Attorney General Barr was not busy only with the Mueller report this week. He also issued an order on asylum. On Tuesday, his order that he put out basically prevents certain asylum seekers from being released on bond while their cases are pending. How does the process currently work, and what does this decision mean? Well,
what it means is that for people who have entered illegally, meaning not at the standard ports of entry, that they would be held without bond. That's what Mr. Barr is directing. Now, he's also said that the order won't take effect for 90 days, in part so that the officials can get ready, but also that's going to provide the opportunity for legal challenges, because the idea that they can be held without bond, without any opportunity for bond, is pretty surprising. The timing on these hearings is running at least 700 days now, and that if we're going to start gathering up more and more and more people seeking asylum, then those times are only going to stretch out further and further.
And Alani, with this asylum order, again, it doesn't take effect for 90 days, but will this new policy change anything in terms of how many people are trying to cross the border?
I don't know that it will. I think fundamentally what it highlights is the inability of Congress to act. I mean, this really is a responsibility of the Congress to act to reform the immigration system. Even on the asylum system, or the asylum process specifically, reforms to the asylum process, the number of immigration judges to process these cases, this is all something that Congress should be handling, quite frankly. But what we're seeing now over the last several years is action that's happened on immigration has always been via executive action, whether it was the creation of the DACA program by President Obama, childhood separation issues, which President Trump addressed early in his term, and now the question of asylum. Really, it's beyond the scope of what the executive should be dealing with.
All right, let's turn to state politics. Tall this week marked Governor Gavin Newsom's first 100 days in office, and he's put out a lot of major announcements, including a statewide purchasing system to rein in prescription drug costs. He also put in place a moratorium on the death penalty. How would you assess his performance so far?
One of the really interesting things about Gavin Newsom so far is how much he's managed to make himself a national figure already. You know, the really forward-leaning move to put the moratorium on the death penalty, especially because you have Kamala Harris running for president. Anything he does like that immediately inserts itself into the presidential debate and then the more national conversation among Democrats. And, you know, we've seen this from Gavin Newsom in his history. He was very forward-leaning on gay marriage, for example, and you've seen his ability to sort of inject things into the national Democratic conversation. And so, you know, but he also played into the national conversation in a way he probably might want to take back with his high-speed rail announcement that got really fumbled and happened at the exact same time that the Green New Deal was being discussed here in Washington, and makes a big push for high-speed rail. And so Republicans up here were very quick to seize on it as sort of an example of why that wouldn't work. And so we've sort of seen it play both ways, but it is really fascinating how he's already been able to make that national impact.
Well, there was a high-speed rail, and also, he also warned cities and counties that they could lose their road repair funding unless they met state goals for housing. But then he kind of backtracked on that too and said, hey, we'll set it aside for 4 years. Is he too quick to jump on some of these ideas?
Well, you know, I think on the one hand, being an active governor is a change from what we've seen the last several years. If you talk to Sacramento insiders, the first observation they'll make about Gavin Newsom is how different the pace and cadence of his administration is from Jerry Brown, particularly in Jerry Brown's second term. So I do think that in some ways it's an active attempt to contrast, and there's no penalty for him so far for overstepping, or no penalty for being active. So why not? Why not pursue the policy priorities one has?
But could it backfire? Could it make it seem seem harder to tell what his main priorities are when he's just going so rapid fire with all this policy and that pronouncements?
It certainly could be, but the big ones, the death penalty announcement, the focus on homelessness, now the move on health care in terms of giving health care Medi-Cal to undocumented immigrants as well, those are all things that I think will put him in good stead whether he actually succeeds or not. The attempt sometimes in politics matters even more than whether the politician's actually successful.
Right, and I think these are very popular in California. Tal was saying that sometimes he's ahead of the curve, but I think less so if you think about his base here in California.
All right, David Levine with UC Hastings, Lanhee Chen with the Hoover Institution, and also Tal Kopin in Washington, D.C. with the San Francisco Chronicle. Thank you all. Always nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now to an examination of implicit bias. Jennifer Eberhardt is a social psychologist at Stanford University and a 2014 recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. Her work has advanced our understanding of race and inequality by revealing the ways that implicit or unconscious bias can have profound effects in society, from the courtroom to the classroom. In her new book, she says we all can get better at spotting situations that trigger stereotypes, and shares her own personal experiences on how to fight them. Joining me now is Professor Jennifer Eberhardt. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
You say in your book that racial conditioning starts young, even as young as 3 months old. How does that happen?
Yeah, so researchers have found that infants as young as 3 months of age are already showing a preference for faces of their own racial group. So it happens partly because of how our brains are wired, but partly because of the faces that we're exposed to normally. And to the extent that we live in segregated spaces, we're exposed to faces of our own racial group. And so our brain gets practiced up on that, and then that affects us.
So with this inherent racial bias, you said that it intensifies over time. What drives it to become stronger?
So I don't know, it intensifies over time as the sort of, well, I think that, as when you're young and you're a child, you don't show maybe as much bias as, as an adult would. And part of that is just kind of trying to figure out sort of what the stereotypes are about the various groups. Sometimes when you're young, you don't even know what the social categories are, what the groups are. And so, so as you learn that, and as you sort of learn more about, how these various groups are positioned in the world, then you can experience, and express more bias.
And we've heard a lot about how stereotypes can affect people of different races in criminal justice, for example, but also even in education, right? You cite a study by social scientists that I found very interesting. In your book, you say that study described a phenomenon called whitening the resume, where even college students who are looking for jobs are responding to implicit bias in interesting ways. What are they doing?
Yeah, well, they were sort of trying to downplay their racial group membership in order to, be more sort of marketable on the job market. So that would mean maybe whitening their names, and so black applicants, for example, would, instead of putting, Jamal. Andrew Jackson would maybe write J. Andrew Jackson, something like that. And the same with Asian applicants, also were whitening their resumes through the names, but also through, the kinds of activities that they said they like to engage in. And so they were more inclined to put down, activities that were more exciting, like snowboarding and those kinds of things.
Treks.
Yeah, exactly. So to be more relatable, so that people would think that they could fit in.
So we know that implicit bias affects a broad section of society, from education, employment, the criminal justice system, despite the fact that many business executives and teachers and police officers don't view themselves as biased. So how do we begin to address that?
Yeah, I think one sort of big issue is just how we define what bias is. I think that people have the sense of bias as, people who are burning crosses and people who are filled with hate and so forth. But, when we talk about unconscious bias or implicit bias, we're talking about, these beliefs and these feelings that people have about social groups that can influence them, even without their awareness. And so you don't need intention, you don't need, motivation to do bad or evil things. It's just something that's there, that these associations are built up over time.
So then how do you teach people to recognize that and also to stop them from resulting in prejudicial behavior to people from other ethnic or racial groups?
Yeah, well, one way to help people to recognize it is to help them to understand that we're not always acting on our biases. So there are certain conditions or there are certain situations that make bias more likely than others. And so learning what those conditions are, I think, is pretty critical.
Can you give an example?
So the one example is just we're more likely to act on bias when we make decisions really quickly. So when we're forced to think fast, we're more likely to rely on these sort of automatic associations that we've built up over time. And so that's going to potentially affect our decision making.
So maybe step back?
Step back, slow down, and to take your time and sort of think things through.
You've worked a lot with police departments, including the Oakland Police Department, and have they adopted some of these procedures, and has it worked for them in measurable ways?
Yes, so since I've been there, we've worked with the department to, add a question, a simple question to the form that they complete when they make routine traffic stops. And
what is that question?
The question is, was this stop intelligence-led? Yes or no? So it's just a checkbox, yes or no. And by intelligence-led, they mean, was the stop, could you actually tie this specific individual to, some particular crime, and just slowing down again and stopping to think about that, and that leads officers to think about whether the stop is is a high priority stop and all of that,
and not based on something prejudicial.
Yeah, exactly. So that led to a huge drop by 40% in the number of stops that were made from one year to the next.
What about this concept of color blindness, not seeing color, not thinking about race? Is that a solution?
Right. I think many people believe that it is, but the research should give us pause on that, right? Because the research shows that when you teach children to be colorblind, or if we try to be colorblind, we not only not see color, but we cannot see discrimination. So if we're trying to be colorblind because we're interested in, furthering racial equality and that kind of thing, then it's producing the opposite, where we are, more inclined to sort of ignore inequality rather than combat it. So it's not the solution we think it is.
Very interesting. So much more that we could discuss about this. Thank you for your time today, Jennifer Eberhardt. Your new book is Biased. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.